Hey everybody, I have a video here for you today. Now over the weekend, I was asked by a subscriber, have I ever made a video on the lost city of gold, Eldorado, this legend coming out of South America? And I had not. And I remembered some initial hunches about Eldorado, but I've never really looked into them. So I decided to explore a little. And not only am I going to make a video about Eldorado, I'm going to show you the city where this legend sprang out of. Now, a lot of people think this is just a made-up story, a fable, a myth, but if you use some common sense, I believe we can find the origin. And you really have two choices with this story about Eldorado. One, it's totally made up, or two, people have just been looking in the wrong region. And I think it's the latter. People have been just looking in the wrong region. And I believe we have all seen videos from the city of Eldorado. But let's talk about Eldorado and what we know. It says, when the phrase Eldorado was first used, it referred to an individual, not a city. In fact, Eldorado translates into the Gilded Man. In the highlands of present-day Colombia, the Muisca people had a tradition where their king would cover himself in gold dust and jump into Lake Guadavita, from which he would emerge clean. Neighboring tribes knew of the practice and told the Spanish. Thus was born the myth of Eldorado. So Eldorado was the name of the Gilded One, and other definitions of Eldorado are the Golden One, the Golden Man, and the Golden Indian, or the Golden King. And just later on, Eldorado was the name placed on this ancient city of gold. Now, let's talk about when this all started. And it says, Eldorado was discovered in 1537. The Muisca people were discovered in 1537 by Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. They were swiftly conquered and their cities looted. The Spanish knew the Eldorado legend and dredged Lake Guavita. They found some gold, but not very much, and the greedy conquistadors refused to believe that such a disappointing haul could be the real Eldorado. They therefore kept searching for it. And that is the story coming out of the Spanish. And they told people the original story is that Eldorado was located in the Andean highlands, in the highlands of Colombia. And if you were explorers out looking for gold, would you give up where a lost city of gold was to the general, populace reading the story or learning about this story? No, you would have put out disinformation so other people were looking in the wrong region, and that maybe you could discover the lost city of gold. And that's why I think people have been looking in the wrong place. And the year 1537 is very important, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But many other people went out looking for Eldorado, including Sir Walter Raleigh, and after a failed second attempt, he was executed when he returned to England. I believe people that were funded by kings and queens from Europe who went out searching for Eldorado, they came back and they made up stories. And that's very important because it says it kept moving around. The place where Eldorado was supposed to be kept changing as one expedition after another failed to find it. At first, it was supposed to be in the north, somewhere in the Andean highlands. And when stories and false stories have been put out about the location, common sense tells you you can go back to the very first description of it to find where the location actually was. Let's go back to Google Earth here. So, I believe that the truth of Eldorado, we can narrow it down to the Andean highlands. And this is the region of the Andean highlands. So I believe this is where Eldorado was located. Not in Venezuela or Brazil or up the Amazon or in Guyana like other people thought it was based on false stories. We can return to the first story and find out where Eldorado actually was. And going back to the ceremony where this legendary king that the Spanish gave the name Eldorado. This artifact was found in 1969. It says, incredibly, a gold raft depicting a scene exactly like that described by Juan Rodriguez Fraley was found in 1969 by 3 villagers in a small cave in the hills just to the south of Bogota. This scene of a man covered in gold going out into a sacred lake, such as Lake Guadavita, is the real story of Eldorado. And that's very important. It says, the scene with a man going out into a sacred lake, such as Lake Guadavita. So there was a sacred lake that was the origin of this story, and cultures and tribes around this area use lakes in their region to recreate the original ceremony. So I think that is very important. And it says here, let's just go back to Google Earth. Now, since we're going to look for Eldorado, where it was originally said, the Andean Highlands, do we have a sacred lake in the Andean Highlands? And Eldorado, this king, was linked to creation also. And we have a sacred lake in the Andean Highlands. In fact, we have the sacred lake, and it is called Lake Titicaca. And so, I believe this is the area that this legend was born out of. Now, do we have anything that can relate this region to gold? Well, it says here, artifacts of cold-hammered native gold have been discovered in a secure and undisturbed terminal archaic burial context at Jixeromoco, a multi-component lake archaic early formative period site in the southwestern Lake Titicaca basin of Peru. The burial dates to 2155 to 1936 BC make this the earliest work gold recovered to date, not only from the Andes, but from the Americas as well. So we have the earliest gold coming out of this region. So this makes sense that there was an ancient city of gold, and Eldorado obviously would have had to have been a very, very ancient city as it kind of digressed into just myth and fable. So we have the earliest gold in the Americas actually coming out of this region of the sacred lake in the high Andes, right where Eldorado is said to come from. And this is the area where that discovery was found. Now, obviously, Lake Titicaca, we have, just to the north of where this was found, we have Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. These very ancient, mysterious sites. Could this been the lost city of gold, Eldorado? Well, I think it was. Now, here it says, legend of the Aymara Indians say that the creator god Viracocha rose from Lake Titicaca during the time of darkness to bring forth light. Viracocha was a storm god and a sun god who was represented as wearing the sun for a crown with thunderbolts in his hands and tears descending from his eyes. And this is, they talk about the legend and the lake, the sacred lake, and the creator god Viracocha, and this is where the legend of Eldorado comes from. And on this website, it talks about gold found at the bottom of Lake Titicaca, gold artifacts. It says, located in the Andes on the border of Peru and Bolivia, Lake Titicaca is the largest lake in South America. And it says, a team of underwater archaeologists that participated in an expedition that began 2 months ago have just found a number of relics that are from different eras, both Inca and pre-Inca. We found 2,000 objects and fragments. It says divers in 20 meters of water found these objects off the island of the sun. It says scientists participating in the project unearthed 31 gold fragments, mainly around the island of the sun. The legend holds that mythical founders of the Inca Empire emerged from the lake's waters. And this is Google Earth, and up here is the island of the sun, and this is where those artifacts have been found. And this is the origin where all these cultures in the Andes had this ceremony on the lake and the Golden King, and he ends up diving into the lake and re-emerging from the lake. This origin is with the Viracocha god coming from Tiwanaku. And you remember I said that the Spanish came across this tribe in Colombia in 1537, and they learned about legends of Eldorado, and this is where the story was born out of in 1537. Well, where did the Spanish go in 1538, the very next year? I think they knew of Eldorado. It says this: on the other hand, it is known that the Spaniards under Pizarro were in the Lake Titicaca region in 1538, and it would be surprising if they had not sent a small force to investigate its most famous and richest islands. So the very next year, after the Spanish learned about the myth of Eldorado, where were they? Well, out of all places, they ended up in the highlands of what is present-day Bolivia, searching the islands of Lake Titicaca. That cannot be ignored. So I think I have presented plenty of evidence to make it at least a very, very good possibility that Tiwanaku was the origin of the Eldorado story. But just to clinch it, let me read this. It says the Austrian archaeologist Arthur Poznański, and he lived between 1873 and 1946, investigated Tiwanaku for almost 30 years and made surprising discoveries. In many polished stone blocks, he found rows of small round holes that might have served to hold something. In 1943, during a conference, Poznański presented a Tiwanaku stone block with 5 gold nails embedded in it. His research concluded that the walls, cornices, and gates of Tiwanaku, including the sun gate, were originally covered with gold. And further research says this: only such a state visit, we suggest, and they kind of link it to the gods, we suggest can explain the elaborate architecture of Pumapunku. And once again, this site is within like walking distance of Tiwanaku, and these sites are linked. It says it's royal like piers, and yes, it's gold-plated enclosure, for that is precisely what archaeologists had found at Pumapunku. Incontrovertible evidence that gold plates cover not only portions of the gate, as were the back panels of the Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku, but that whole walls, entrances, and cornices were plated with gold. So that is your city of gold, people. I think this is a very good possibility. This is Tiwanaku, and this is all that is left. People have not linked this to Eldorado because there's no evidence of gold here, but obviously gold would have been hauled off over the thousands of years since this was built, that there is no gold here remaining, and archaeologists have theorized, based on their work, that these places were covered in gold at one time. This is what Tiwanaku looks like. And if the Gate of the Sun, this is what Tiwanaku looks like. But if the Gate of the Sun was originally covered with gold, as Arthur Poznański theorizes, and I will always listen to somebody who investigated a site thoroughly and for decades, if this actually was covered in gold, then this would have been the depiction, and people say this is Viracocha, but other researchers say this is the origin of what evolved into the Viracocha myth, and this is precisely the golden Indian, the gilded one, the golden one, and this is where that comes from. We do not know the name of the original god, but the Spanish called him Eldorado. So I hope you thought this was all very interesting. This is Tiwanaku, the origin of Eldorado. Hope you thought this was interesting. I sure did researching this. You have a nice day.